Possibly discuss all day because there's so many aspects to it. It's not, you know, we've really been restricted to talking about farming in the past couple of segments. We'll continue to talk about it, but there is so much more to talk about as well. Now, somebody that I wanted to include in our conversation before we had to say goodbye to our SABC 2 viewers was Dr. Aninka Claasens in our Sea Point studio. Dr. Claasens, prior to the 1993 Native Land Act, there were laws that existed to keep non-Europeans and blacks from retaining land. How could land be apportioned in a manner that accommodates all the disposed when the land rights can be traced back to, I mean, the days of the Khoi and the San, really?
Yeah, so basically the 1913 Land Act, I think that's what you're referring to. And
yes, indeed.
There were laws, for example, in the Transvaal that prohibited black ownership. But there were a lot of African people who purchased land prior to the 1913 Act, for example, from the 1860s. And, you know, one of the things that I really want to come back to is that current government policy is not about transferring ownership to the beneficiaries of land reform. We've got the state land lease and disposal policy, which now, contrary to what we had after 1994, requires that people be perpetual tenants. The recapitalization policy also requires that people be perpetual tenants, and that is very, very dangerous for the vulnerable. There's no possibility under this recapitalization policy that poor farmers and women farmers in the former homelands can actually graduate to ownership. And so what you've got actually is massive mining expansion into agricultural areas and the land just being taken away from farmers because of deals between traditional leaders, mining companies, BEE partners, and this is happening on a massive scale throughout the former homelands. You're having it in KwaZulu-Natal around coal mining and iron mining, in Tuba, Melmoth, the whole platinum belt in Northwest, and people need secure rights in order to assert and hold onto their land in the face of these deals, which are really being done by politically connected elites. And it's an incredible irony that 100 years after the 1913 Land Act, which prohibited black ownership, we have an ANC government saying there won't be ownership for land reform beneficiaries, just leasehold. And I'd really like the Secretary General to elaborate why we have come to this point that we have moved away from transferring ownership to only giving people conditional use rights like there was under the South African Development Trust during apartheid.
Well, let's do that right now.
The focus has been, let me break it into two. If you take communal land where you give a group of beneficiary land, that has not worked perfectly. It has created more problems than solutions. The second one is that many of those people opted for financial settlements instead of getting alternative land. Let's say, for example, you have land that has been developed fully now, and you say, okay, your claim is successful, but instead of people getting alternative land, people have opted for financial settlement. That is dangerous in the sense that the amount of money spent on land redistribution continues to grow, but the amount of land that has been transferred remains the same. Now, why don't we move to individual ownership? Actually, at the beginning of the program, after 1994, farmers were given title deeds. People forget that. They were given title deeds. Majority of them sold that land and made money out of it and left farming. Now, the question of leasing is a question of, first of all, committing that farmer to that land so that that farmer must not just sell that land, must use that land for production. And in the long term, title deeds will be issued. The Minister of Rural Development put this at about 30 years lease, so that people must be committed and must develop again what I call the lost skill and the relationship with the land. And then further down the line, you get your title deed. For example, my home is in the rural areas. One of that has happened there is that the use of land in the rural areas has collapsed totally. Even before people become farmers, people don't use the little land they have. There's no food production in the rural areas, in the majority of areas. Even when government intervenes and brings a projects for them they help them for 3 years. It's okay, right, go on your own. That project collapses immediately. Unless you can have a proper cooperative which is managed properly, that is not going to work. So the question of title deeds should not be the beginning and the end of the land debate.
Okay, I hope that answers your question quite correctly. Here's another question, and I want to give a good answer to this one. This is from Pile out of on Twitter, asking, what the KwaZulu-Natal Ngonyama Trust is doing is pure stealing. This is what they're saying. How does government allow Ngonyama Trust to take land from the rightful owners?
I'm glad you raised this question. It's a worrying question.
Yeah.
But I don't want us to think that there is nothing happening, even on Ngonyama Trust itself. I think there's a lot done by Amakosi, by Ngonyama himself, to try and address these issues, to raise the issue of rural programs and projects, among which education and training should remain cardinal in our focus through, amongst other things, job creation, unemployment, inequity. All those issues need to be thoroughly addressed. I'm glad that at Isulabalim, for instance, as one of the solutions, we've set up a house. That house is like an incubation center where we offer a lot of training, do research, and try and translate the needs of the people in the rural areas where we focus, in the township, and say there's a lot that can be done to engage small-scale farmers in the whole value chain. That is from tilling the land up to the consumer in the shop. Yeah. Look at mechanization. We've come up with a good plan there at Isulabalim, where we have a kind of a tiller that is using diesel, where people at their respective lands in the rural areas, they can use to farm the land easily, because head hoeing is very strenuous sometimes. That's why people are beginning to try and avoid it, because you need to look at new technology, because I mean everything is changing. Even the rural areas, people are wanting to see a mechanization implement that they use. They need also to be assisted with agri-input, and that's why as Isulabalim, we have a wing that is called Isulabalim Agricultural Tertiary Cooperative that is looking at the empowerment of the agricultural cooperative and related cooperatives, where people will acquire the skills, because we can talk until cows come back home. But if people don't have the skills,
it's not going to happen.
They will fail.
Yeah,
they will fail because they are not prepared for response. That's why I agree with my colleague there, Mr. Van der Meij, when he says the commercial farmers need to transfer skills.
Absolutely.
Through, amongst other things, job creation.
Okay.
So that people begin to know what they are doing there, because farming is not as easy as we think. It's a profession. You need to fast track economic growth by enhancing the skills, professionalism, and business acumen of the small scale farmers and SMME in the rural areas.
It can cause more devastation if you don't have the skills. By handing over a farm without those skills, you won't make money, you'll lose money, and
we've
you'll
seen
enhance
it. The government has
poverty.
played a very crucial role, but people still fail because they're not prepared.
That's a big issue.
There, and we want to invite the government to come on board, and private sector and investors,
which is a big thing. We need the skills.
Yes.
Let's talk skills, because the skills transfer is a big thing. And we opened up this conversation, Hans, by you talking about it and openly saying that there need to be partnerships. These partnerships hopefully are already there, but they need to be enhanced and worked on more. What is going to be done? I mean, I have seen, and I must say, I'm seeing a great relationship that's happening between everybody off air, which for me is very heartwarming, because it goes to show that what is happening behind the scenes is a lot of hard work, and I can see that people are working together to ensure that things are being transferred and work together in the right way. But skills is what it is at the bottom of it. Empowerment is what at the bottom of all of this. What is being done?
Well, first and foremost, I think we're working on attaining policy certainty with government on exactly where are we heading and what should the policies be. So it's not only certainty, but the content of policies that should be the oil that makes the partnerships work.
Yeah.
I believe that government has the capacity to facilitate processes, but that most of the work needs to be done by industry role players themselves.
Yeah.
So I think that is where we need to find each other, exactly what the industry requires from government to assist them in this important task. And I believe that South Africans must still work on a common vision. Many believe, and I appreciate the view of a person that's unemployed and marginalized to say, give me land and I will be better off. The big challenge for South Africa is how to develop communities, individuals' capacity to be a role player in a more modern economy. To look at the social upliftment challenges, and I think our own organization has, even at a low level, started really to look at what can be done to advance the skills level of people working and living on farms, to do other things than just the simple farm worker type of work. I think it is not a great aspiration just to be a field worker in agriculture. How can you really enhance the quality of life on farms? Then, if we can successfully address that, I think the issue of land becomes, I think, less complicated, because we must deal with housing, we must deal with services. Eventually, being an emotive issue, agricultural land is eventually a resource to produce food for the country and for the world. And we must make best use of that. So I think we need to unpack the social challenges. We need to unpack the access to housing, decent living conditions for rural dwellers, and then say, how do we develop the agricultural base to be more inclusive, more participatory, but sustainable and productive.
Why are we still talking? Because and this is a question that I need to ask, because I'm reading comments coming through and they're very worrying for me. Somebody's saying here, Mr. Wright, saying land issue is still a sensitive matter, which we've used this word too many times, and it needs to be resolved before the people take the law into their own hands and start with things like land invasions. Now, when you talk about we need the policies to be in place, why are they not there already? We should have these policies fast-tracked so that we can move this. This is where food comes from, job creation. This is where we can tap into the much-needed skills and unemployment rate that South Africa needs to eliminate.
Policies are in place, they're evolving. But what we should always remember is that it's so complex to run a dual system. The communal land tenure system is complex. And to me, it should be simplified. So that yes, chief owning the land, but how does that relate to people? Because in any village, you'll find that certain families will have a piece of land. There will be families that have no piece of land at all. That will just have a site to build a dwelling. And it's quite a complex issue in the rural areas. That is one area that we must apply our minds to. But the question of policies, the policies are there, they're evolving. That's why, for example, we've opted for what we call fair and equitable pricing and instituted the question of the evaluator general. It's because markets sometimes, I know that Hans loves them, markets sometimes distort the reality of the situation, because if there's a lot of demand, the price will go up. And markets can distort the question of the land redistribution. Then the question of the evaluator general, which will be in place with a legislation on expropriation, but that expropriation is not expropriation without compensation. It is expropriation with fair and equitable compensation. That law is being piloted in Parliament right now. And what we have said to our leadership in the NC. It is time that some of the decisions we are taking that we are reluctant to do, government itself must test some of this in the Constitutional Court.
Yeah.
Is this constitutional? Instead of waiting to be taken to court, you say, I want to do this. Is it constitutional? For example, there was an outcry about the pronouncement that we don't want foreign nationals to own land. People said, you are scaring away industrialists. I said, but it is a global phenomenon. You go to many countries, you don't go there and own land.
Yeah.
You lease land. Why is it a scary issue here? But the issue is, those laws must be in place. Once they are in place, we must execute and be prepared to take some of the cases to the Constitutional Court to test the constitutionality of the decision and not wait for citizens to take us to court.
Yeah, I want to talk more about that as well, the foreign ownership and the leasing of the land, and we can talk about that in just a few minutes' time. But I want to continue on that question that was raised, and you have touched on it with regard to policies, but land grabs and occupation. I imagine you deal with farmers, obviously on a daily basis, and you speak to them. It seems that land grabs and occupation is a citizen's response these days to taking the law into their own hands. What is farmers' response to this? Are they fearing for their lives that in fact this is the route that's going to be taken by a lot of people, invading lands, taking their farms from right underneath them?
I think early in the new democracy that we have, there were court cases that made it, I think, now a precedent that government will act if due process was followed by the landowner in terms of the legislation for people that's entering the land unlawfully. So up to now, we have the confirmed view of the ruling party and government that if you follow the correct processes, it will be dealt with. Quite clearly, there is a school of thought in the political arena that is the thing to do. But government, as far as I'm concerned, was clear about it. They reject that approach.
Yeah.
And if the correct procedures are followed, we have seen a speedy and the correct handling of these interventions. But fact of the matter is that farm safety and security is a concern. The nature of farming is that people live in isolated areas and conditions, and that brings an additional burden to farming. It is additional cost to farming. It is additional disincentive to farming as well. So I think clear policies, clear utterances from the government, and I think communities that act coherently in addressing these issues is very important. The issue is, yes, South Africa has social challenges to resolve. And I think public at large must see the right policies in place and the correct service delivery to alleviate the pressure that may lead to distortive practices eventually. Agriculture and agricultural land is just a part of it. I think it requires an holistic approach to really address these issues in the correct way.
Yeah, I mean that's something which I think is admirable from the ANC's behalf, and the fact that the rule of law will be applied and must be obeyed when it comes to land issues is a big thing. However, many feel that the economy structure and land policy is perceived to be more exclusionary rather than it's exclusive as opposed to protecting the poor, which is a problem. But how valid is this? Is this the way it should be read?
No, the reality of the matter is that poverty is not virtue. Okay, it's like small-scale farming. It's not virtue. It's a stage in development. What we should resolve is access to land. That must be resolved. Once access to land is resolved, then people will use their skills and their love for farming to improve themselves from poverty to decent living. In rural areas, for example, where people work on the land, those families are not regarded as poor because they harvest every year, they sustain themselves. If there is surplus, they sell that surplus. Now, what is more important to me is that land grabbing is an emotional issue, as I said earlier.
Yeah.
When people play to the emotion of the people, you will see land grabbing. I think there is a party that is trying to do that, play into the emotions of the people. But the reality of the matter is that if you do it haphazardly, you are going to actually push people into more poverty. Examples of certain countries that have opted that way. Today, people have access to land, but they have to import every piece of food.
Yeah.
And to me, land redistribution must be done systematic, responsible, and people must be helped to use land as a means of production. Otherwise, you can have land and be emotionally happy and starve to death on that land. People must be allowed to get to that land, use it, eat, and they must sustain themselves on the land.
Right.
And that is the key. But people are impatient is something that we should also appreciate. That the people say it's now 21 years, we have not access to land. That's why the question of access to land is a very important issue.
It really is. I like that point. People could be emotionally happy with that land, but they can starve to death on that land. Aninka, do you have any views on this, particularly with regard to the land grab issue?
Well, I mean, I think that I'd like to come back to this question of the implementation of policies. You know, there are reports on the presidency's website about the way in which the government has failed to implement restitution and the way in which the recapitalization policy and the funding for that has been diverted to a few very rich farmers who have been selected in a completely arbitrary kind of way. And I think it's all very well to have this comfortable conversation where everyone agrees with one another. But what about the people who are being left out? I mean, we hear the Secretary General saying land will be transferred to the chiefs. I'm sure the chiefs are very happy about that. But what about the ordinary people who have indigenous ownership to that land and often strong rights in law, coming from the old PTO system? What do they think about their land being transferred to the chiefs for the very first time in our history? So I think that this conversation is very comfortable, but it leaves out the fact that there is a tiny budget for land reform, and that this reopening of land claims and this solicitation of claims by chiefs is something which is full of empty promises, because there is simply no budget. The budget has gone down year after year after year, and 30% of the claims already made have not been settled. So it's very easy for everyone here to say, yes, we like one another. But what we're actually seeing is a process of elite capture of the entire land reform vision, the entire vision of land reform. And it's about actually disempowering ordinary people, many of whom purchased land, especially in the Northwest and Limpopo, before the 1913 Land Act or through exemptions from it, who now have to stand by powerlessly while vast mines expand on their land, and when they try and go to court to try and get interdicts or to try and get tribal books of account audited, they're told they have no locus standi. They have no locus standi to find out what's happening to mining deals on land they purchased. So I think we've really got to look at the bigger picture, and we can't exclude the possibility that there will be violence, because when there's no redistribution taking place, people will resort to self-help and self-protection. And so I think that this whole conversation is falsely reassuring, because it leaves out the majority of South Africans who want land and in terms of the Constitution are entitled to land.
Oh, Aninka, you've opened up a great can of worms here. I can tell you what's happening here in studio. I've got all of my guests putting up their hands desperate to respond. So I'm going to go one by one, and you're each going to give me a very short response, because I can see what's happening. Let's go. Hans, your response to this.
I think eventually people want to own land if they work the land. And if government transfer land, I can understand that there must be some period to see whether that guy is the right guy who wants to farm. But I think land must be transferred. And I think there are housing in cities and towns that can also be transferred. And we can make a lot more people in South Africa owners of South Africa than is currently the case. So if that is a point, valid point. Secondly, the big elephant in the room presently that prohibits redistribution in agriculture is the reopening of the restitution process.
Okay.
Basically, border to border in KwaZulu-Natal and Limpopo province and in Mpumalanga are then again open for claims. And that makes it a difficult challenge. A farmer may empower a certain say, partner that he wants to farm with, just to see that land being claimed again.
Yeah.
So that brings a whole lot of uncertainty. We're not without proposals that we want to discuss with government on how to deal with it. But unfortunately, all people cannot own agricultural land if we want to continue forward. There must be a measure how to deal with that challenge. And I think that links again to what she's saying. How are you going to deal with ownership and the redistribution issue? Then one thing that is very important for farmers that want to enter into empowerment deals is to say, is there a tick box to say, if I've done A, B, C, D, I will be deemed to have done my part on behalf of transformation in agriculture, and now you can run your business. Continued uncertainty isn't helpful for the investment decisions that farmers want to enter into with prospective partners. And still, at this point in time, that tick box is lacking.
Okay.
We need to address that as well.
Secretary General?
It's unfortunate that Anita is using that approach of all of us being comfortable in the SABC studio. She understands land better. Actually, she will only understand what she has researched. So this thing of saying you don't know what people say, I know, is a wrong approach to a discussion. It's a serious matter. Land is a serious matter. We must deal with it honestly and openly with each other. Because if we can follow that route, we are going to collapse the whole thing. And I am still emphasizing, people must have access to land. But what should not be allowed is to say people have a constitutional right to have access to land, and therefore they must just go and grab the land. That I will not support. People must get the land, they must get support to make land productive, because the poor that is patronizing, she's patronizing the poor. She thinks that the poor want a piece of land and that's all they want. The poor want a piece of land and be able to produce food out of that piece of land. And once we can have a program that helps those, it's an issue. That's why we say there will be bottlenecks in implementation of certain policies, like for example, recapitalization. It doesn't give rich farmers, many farmers who are beneficiaries to a recapitalization program are farmers who are, most of them, from the rural areas and have access to land because of the government program. And they are started from scratch and they are beginning to produce. Many of them are successful. And I've talked to Minister Gwede and said, Minister Gwede, don't only talk about failures. Please throw around the success stories. Let people see that there are many, many success stories of farmers who came from rural areas who are now commercial farmers. I'm in the Elliot area. I can take you physical to many of them. The Kotois, the Mantashe, and all of them. If you came to them, Kotoi is now owning a stud farm of more than 500 cattle. He went there with 4 cattle from a rural area. My dad will tell you a similar story. I can give you a list of them. You can take SABC there and go and see the success stories.
Yeah,
that is what we should do. Because at this point in time, if we listen to researchers like Anita, we'll think that there is a disaster about to happen. And because they refuse to see success stories.
Aninka, do you agree in a way that perhaps you do refuse to see the success stories, or is it from your research that you have seen that there are more failures than successes? Where do you come to your conclusions?
There are. I mean, if one really looks at farming, subsistence farming, and you look, for example, in KwaZulu-Natal, in Msinga, who are the farmers? They're women, and they're farming on land around the Tugela, and they get very little government support. The government support is going to graduate people into big commercial farmers. So there is pride in land, there's all sorts of skill, but these policies turn people into tenants, and they require them to have a strategic partner, which in a sense ignores the fact that there is skill there that could be supported through practical things like access to markets, breaking into the difficult supply chains that are dominated by the big industrialists. So I've got a lot of confidence that if we had policies, as we did have, that give land and support to those people, we would see a real flowering of agricultural production, because a lot of that agricultural production isn't counted because it's kind of below the radar.
Yeah.
So, but what I'm saying is, and I stand by this, that the current policies ignore the very poor, or not the not so poor, but the people doing small-scale farming, in favor of really holding power at the level of the state. Because if the state keeps ownership of the land and it makes productivity a criterion, then it can always take the land back from people. And it can use land as a source of patronage. Same with traditional leaders. There's Section 25(6) of the Constitution says that anyone whose tenure of land is insecure because of past racially discriminatory laws or practices is entitled to tenure security in terms of the law. And Section 25(9) says government must enact that law.
All right.
21 years later, they haven't enacted that law. When these transfers of land to traditional leaders take place, there will be a court case, as there was in 2010, to challenge the then Communal Land Rights Act. And we will be able to show that people living on that land have rights, both in terms of customary law, as was recognized in the Alex Court judgment, but also often real rights in terms of the old statute law. So I think really it's a question of whom does this benefit and what's driving these policies and who's consulted.
Okay, there's a Twitter question. I know we're going to take a break now, just in a short while, but I have to ask you this one quickly. Mandla, I want you to respond to this question as well, and also on the issue of traditional leaders. There's a viewer who's watching this and also listening to what Aninka is saying, and saying her view is that no rights should be given to traditional leaders. What they do is that they just give the land to the highest bidder and not to those that have the skills to actually develop the land. That's just a comment. Perhaps you can include that in your answer.
I'm glad this question is raised. As a person who grew up in a rural area, Kanta for instance, I seem to concur with what I saw on the Bayete, where it says poor people have the brains and they are able to articulate their issues very well, and that they have the solutions. Amakosi, I don't think we can exclude Amakosi. Amakosi have played a very crucial role now and in the past, because we regard Amakosi as farmers themselves, because they're there in the rural areas, they farm, some farm very successful, and they have a passion for it. If you go to Inkosi, any Inkosi in a rural area, I think my Mr. Gwede Mantashe is a person who grew up in a farm as well, in the rural areas, can agree with me that Amakosi actually have done a lot to facilitate development, agricultural development as well. It's news to us to say that we are not being cared for, we are being ill-treated. Amakosi accept and agree to the democratic principles. That's why some of them are participating very, very well, and there is this synergy growing in the rural, where they participate and work very well with the councillors at the ward level. Things are changing and evolving, and I want to concur with the notion that we need support. Like Islabadim, we do emphasize on their support, and we want to invite others to work with us to address these issues. Things are really changing there in the rural areas. It shall never be the same. That's why I'm not like being sarcastic when I say the ANC and the government needs really to be applauded for the work done in policy formulation. But we are saying, as Islabadim and other structures that I represent, now to mention a few, that there is a need to focus on the implementation of these policies. And when we implement the policies, I want to concur with Mr. Fanarvete, we need to look at the skilling, we need to look at the training. We also need to look at the schools, that the interest and the spirit, and we need to instill this love of agriculture, because we knew what happened in the past, where agriculture was used as punishment for the school. That's why you see young people this age are very reluctant to follow this agriculture as a profession. That's why we say even the curriculum need to address this issue. Skilling must not just start when you have finished school. Even before you finish, from grade 8 to grade 10, we are saying, let's focus on skills. People going to matric should be the people who are going to make it in their life.
Yeah.
People who can pass, people who are smart enough and who come from families that can afford to assist their children to and further education up to the university level. But at the same time, we are saying the rural people must be trained as trainers. Amakos must be trained as, because they have the influence. If Amakos are part and parcel of all this, I can rest you assured that the people have the confidence, and they still have the confidence on Amakos. I think this should be used as a plus, that Amakosi must be, I don't want to say educated and trained like any person, capacitated to deliver on their mandate and on the expectations of the people. But if we treat this positively, I think really it can be more successful. And I share the sentiment with Mr. Mantashe when he says, let us also promote the things that are good there in the rural areas. Because people in the rural areas have the passion. There is one farmer, for instance, at Adam's Mission in Mr. Mbeje there. He's doing a fascinating work, but I've never seen that person on television.
Yeah, we
I've
need to highlight
never seen that person in any of the printed media.
Yeah.
But the guy is doing very well.
Well,
on his own.
I think the
That
media
is why
need
I
to
say
work
even
with,
us,
with your
I mean,
organizations.
to own a 3-story building with all the facilities on our own as Islavalim, I think we've done a little bit that needs to be supported.
And highlighted.
All these initiatives can
Yeah.
change the scenario. This land grab is a new phenomenon. I don't want even to comment about it because it's never happened. I'm born and bred in the rural areas, and I farmed with my mother who never worked, but she could produce 100 bags of maize, 80 kg of maize, sugar beans, and she had a lot of stock. And today I'm a commercial farmer myself.
Yeah.
So farming is not new. It has to be a passion, and it has to be coupled with the skills to enhance and make sure that you do very well and you are prepared for such response.
All right, Mandla,
those are the things that I think we need to
and this passion that you are showing us this morning as well. Secretary General, there's an issue I want to raise before we end off the broadcast and the conversation, and that of course is the issue of the sunset clause. There's been speak about the sunset clause that this has perceived to have lapsed, and that the focus on property and the economy should now be driven by the Freedom Charter. Would you care to comment on this?
I don't know what sunset clause are they referring to.
I think this would, if we go back,
of land redistribution.
in terms of the protection of private property rights and which limits the democratic state from decisively dealing with the legacy of colonialism.
Read that section in full.
Yeah.
Because the state has never been handicapped by that clause from redistributing land. Because that clause also gives the state a leeway to redistribute land and expropriate land for development. Actually, it's explicit in the Act itself that land can be expropriated for development. And therefore, it can be an inhibition because the Freedom Charter says the land can be shared among those who work it. But many people who talk about land are people who do not work land. That's the people who are actually talking a lot about land.
Yeah.
That's why I love the 50-50 proposal of Gwede, because it highlights the importance of land being shared among those who work it. So when you have a cooperative of farm workers and you give them a share in your business, you are not throwing it away, you are giving it to people who actually make your own business a success because they work the land. Unlike trying to get some people in the city, you put them on the land, they will not work on that land, they will use it for weekend price. And my own view is that let's go to those rural areas, identify people who work the land, go to the farms. And when I visited the Wittenberg Partnership, one of the things that excited me was when a farm worker who spoke in Afrikaans said, "Ons was beter, ons was nou a binnenkant," and then through a circle and say, we take decisions. We're part of taking decisions about where these apples should go, where they should, how much should we invest back into the business. We're part of that. It is early stages to say it's a success story, but it's a practical way of exposing farm workers to ownership, and they become owners of land and produce for themselves. And it excites them, I can tell you.
Yeah.
Because if you think that you can create farmers, you are not going to create farmers. Farmers are not created. You must have passion, you must have love, you must have commitment. Then competence can be developed as you go on. But you must have the ingredients of being a successful farmer through your passion, your love, and your commitment. Then you can develop competence over a period of time. And to me, if we appreciate that, we'll succeed.
Okay, let's wrap this up now. I think we've got 3 minutes, so I'm going to give you each 30 seconds. Very, very quickly, Hans, 30 seconds. Land in South Africa, in a nutshell, your vision.
We have to feed our nation and contribute towards the development of the country, so land is important. Farmers want to play their role. They want government to play a supportive role and limit interventions, rather support initiatives. And I think there is a lot of goodwill, as already been cited, but compulsory things, I think, is not the way to enhance the capacity that we have. There must be rules for sure, there must be policy certainty, we must preserve the collateral value of land, we must sustain the production capacity. But I think we will surprise South Africa by the way we will resolve this and move forward.
Okay, Aninka in Sea Point Studios, give us your closing vision for South Africa and land in 30 seconds, if that's at all possible.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to correct one thing, which is that I'm not opposed to the institution of traditional leadership at all. We work with traditional leaders in many areas. I just question why government is transferring ownership of land to them, and why they want that land to be transferred to them, and why they need that land to be transferred to them if they are as legitimate as and supported as Mr. Mantashe and Dr. Buthelezi say.
All right, Aninka, thank you very, very much. Manda?
Yeah, I think traditional leaders, like any human being, are human beings. If there are issues with them, let's discuss those issues with them. Let's engage them. I don't like to see a situation where any person from anywhere in the hierarchy thinks that anyone cannot think the same. They have their issues. They are aware of the issues, and they have the solution to their issues. I think all that we need to do is to cooperate. And I want to quote the words of a wise man, Priscilla Isaiah Seme, in October 1911 at an ANC conference, where he says, cooperation is the key and a watchdog which opens the doors, the everlasting door which leads into progress and all national success. The greatest success shall come when men have all learned to cooperate, not only with his own kith and kin, but with all the peoples, including the traditional leaders, and with all life, of course.
Okay.
This is saying, before we point a finger, we need to sit down and ensure that we are aware and know exactly what the issue is all about, with whoever. Then, in the context of that, and ask for the input from the very same people who are affected. Because people living in dry land, in drought, will tell you where you can get the water from as a source. But if you don't live there, you will just look at drought and say, this is a very dry land.
Yeah.
So I'm saying, if people have problems, let's ask for solutions from them.
Okay.
If there is a problem with Amakosi, let us use Amakosi. Amakosi has never refused to take part and be part of this dialogue. And they are very mature.
All right.
When we work with them daily. And the community people there in the rural area can think for themselves. Thank you.
Gwede, will you wrap this up for us?
Black South Africans must have access to land. And that person was accelerated. Those were the advantage, Hans, of having access to land for many years must appreciate that those who were deprived access to land desire to access land and produce. And they don't just want land as a gift, they want land to produce. And people must appreciate, those who are in those farms must appreciate the desire and work with us to give those people access to land.
Yes.
Thank you. Everybody, thank you very much for being a part of this panel discussion. As we say, there's so much to discuss. And I know we gave it a long time, but it's never long enough. But thank you so much for all of you, for your time, for your input, and I think for your energy towards this, this very, very serious discussion.